Hello and welcome to this week's edition of The Olive Tree, bringing you the stories of believers living in Israel and the wider Middle East. Today, Samuel Smadja is the founder and CEO of sar-el, one of the largest tour operators in Israel. And nobody is more surprised than he that the company has been so successful. So what's the story? His parents were Jews from Tunisia who immigrated to Israel just after the Second World War. Not only were they pioneers, they were some of the earliest believers in Jesus or Yeshua in Israel in modern times, and life was challenging. In this, the first of 3 programs to share his story, Samuel begins at the beginning.
My parents immigrated to Israel in 1956 after my father received Yeshua as a savior. There was a British missionary in Tunisia, North Africa, who was doing evangelization among the Jewish people. And he led one person to the Lord, and that was my father.
Wow.
And my father went to his mom after reading the Bible for 2 years, and he told his mom that he believes that Yeshua is the Messiah at that time. Now, for my grandmother, it was quite a hard news because my father lost his father, my grandfather, in the Holocaust. He was a businessman doing business between south of France and Tunisia. He was captured south of France and he was taken all the way to Auschwitz, and he never came back. So for my grandmother, it was like losing a second person to the family. For her, it was the Christian who captured her husband. It was the Christians who took her husband to the Holocaust, and he never came back. And now her son believes in a crazy idea that Jesus, Yeshua, is the Messiah. So that was very hard news for my grandmother. So she took him to his uncle and to different rabbis. And one rabbi told my father, listen, you believe what you believe because you read the Bible in French. If you would read in the original language, in Hebrew, you would see that Yeshua is not a Jewish option. And actually, that was the reason my father immigrated to Israel. He immigrated as a young man with his wife. They didn't have any family here. My father wanted to be sure that what he believed was true. And they moved to Israel. And by the grace of God, he was also a vehicle that God has chose to establish one of the first Messianic congregation, if not the first independent Messianic congregation.
He truly was a pioneer then, wasn't he? Because presumably he had to find work as well. What did he do to support his family?
When he immigrated to Israel, the state of Israel put him in a kibbutz, in a farm, like a kibbutz is a moshav, and he was a farmer. He never did farming before that because he came from the city, but they didn't give you the option to choose. They just chose for you, and they put him in a moshav. And by the grace of God, he was doing very, very good farming. The only problem is he couldn't keep quiet about his faith. And the board of the kibbutz had to do a voting because they were afraid that he will influence the kibbutz with his new faith and all that. And 50% of the people asked that he would leave the kibbutz. And he left the kibbutz and he moved to Jerusalem and he started the Messianic congregation, and he started a publication, a small printing press, in order to print Bibles in Hebrew and also books for evangelization, because at that time there was no Hebrew material for evangelism.
And as you say, he was one of the first Messianic believers really in the land at that time.
Yeah, maybe there were less than 20.
Wow. How did things develop?
As you said, he was a pioneer. He had on his heart to bring to the Jewish people the fact that you can be a Jew and believe in Yeshua as your savior. Something that was not warmly received. On the contrary, you have to understand that in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the immigration to Israel was mainly immigration after the Holocaust in Europe. So this generation did not want to hear anything about Jesus. They immediately relate anything that has to do with Jesus with the Holocaust. So before even you had the chance to debate on the fact if he's the Messiah, what's the role of the Messiah, what's the purpose of the Messiah, and so on, you had to debate on the issue, if Jesus came for the Jewish people, how come the Jewish people suffer so much under his name, so to say, or so to call? So at that time, persecution was very big because the Orthodox movement in Israel did not want to hear anything about it and did anything they could in order to stop him and the beginning of the movement. So that was very challenging. But as you said, he was a pioneer, and I believe that pioneer has a special spirit in them. When they see a wall, they go head first towards the wall instead of bypass the wall. So opposition did not stop him.
Now, you were the fourth child. So
Yes.
what are your earliest memories then of life in Jerusalem at that time, with your father being such an outspoken person and you having to go to school in the shadow of all of that?
Yeah. I probably denied the Messiah more than all of us together because at the time, growing up, Christian was a bad name. Although my father was a pioneer, I knew it was the truth. I knew Yeshua was the Jewish Messiah for the Jewish people, and I knew the prophecy because my father always took the time to teach us the prophecy and so on and so on, but I was not willing to pay the price. If people would ask me in school and so on, I many, many times denied out of fear. I remember when we were going to the congregation or when we were driving in the car, my father had a small Beetle when we were kids. And I remember every time we sat in the car, my father had a habit to pray before he would drive. And we would live in a big apartment building. So he was praying that God will keep us safe, and I was praying that nobody would see us praying, because
Oh, you're honest.
so that was the thing. And going to the congregation, when I grew up, they burned my father's car. They put us a small bomb in the door,
Oh, wow.
and things like that. And as children, we're not allowed to answer the phone because my father would get death threats on the phone from people who, not from the majority, just from extreme groups in Judaism. Because, for them, God is fulfilling the prophecies. He's bringing the Jewish back to the land, and here you are trying to bring Jews to Christianity. They could not understand that you can be a Jew and believe in Yeshua. And that's why it was very important for my father. I have to say that he didn't lead too many people to the Lord, but he definitely made it known that you can be a Jew and believe that Yeshua is the Messiah.
So you went through school. Presumably you then went into the army. What sort of an experience was that for you?
I went to the army at the end of 81. Mid 82, there was the Lebanon War. So I was a motorcyclist in the army. I was in Lebanon for a period. And during the army, for me, was the point where I said, okay, God, I was in a situation there that I really heard the voice of the Lord saying what he said to Elijah, if you're for me, you have to choose, are you for the Baal, or are you wanting to serve the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Israel? And at that point, I really dedicated my life. Although throughout my life, I knew that Jesus, Yeshua, is the real Messiah of Israel. But at that point, I committed my life seriously to the Lord.
And what plans did you have for your life at that time, post-army?
So I have to say that I didn't have any plans. Growing up, I was dyslexic, and I had a very hard time writing, and definitely in English. And reading was a very hard time. I graduated high school, but I didn't get any diploma because I couldn't do the test. At that time, they didn't really understand dyslexia, and they just thought that something is wrong with me. My father, being a strong man, convinced the school to put me in any class as long as I'm not on the streets. And by the grace of God, there was a class for girls to study tourism, and it was only for girls. And they asked my father, at that time they wouldn't ask us, They asked my parents, and my father said, put him there as long as he doesn't walk on the streets. All the boys were going to study car mechanic, all those manly thing. And I went to a class with 35 girls. There were 3 other boys, and I didn't pass, but I knew I liked it. I knew I liked tourism. And I was teasing everybody. I said, when I'll be 30, I'll have my own travel agency. And everybody made fun of me.
Mm-hmm.
When I finished the army, my father, after a week, in Israel, when you finish the army, they give you, you take vacation, you travel, you party, and so on. After a week, my father woke me up at 7 o'clock in the morning. I asked him, what happened? There's a war or something? What happened that you're waking me up so early? And he said, you have to go to find a work. And I told him, but I'll come. Yet my father had a printing press that my brother is still running. So I said, I'll come and work at the printing press. He says, no, you cannot work for me unless you work somewhere else for 5 years. And if you're successful, then you can come work for me.
Oh, wow.
I said, Dad, if I'm successful, I don't think I'll come work for you. He says, that's it. I want you to work in something that God has called you. He says, if you don't go and look for work, you cannot live in the house. I was very upset. I couldn't understand why he took my brother in and with me he didn't, but he saw something that I didn't. And I went to work in a hotel at the front desk. And when I was in the front desk, I understand that I'm on the wrong side of the desk. I saw some tour operators bring groups to Israel, and I said, wow, I want to do that. So I went and I interviewed in different offices, and nobody hired me till I found a small agency. And I said, you know what, I'll work for you for free. And if I'll make you some money, we'll share the profit. And I worked for this tour company. And I told him I have one condition. He says, what? I told him that you and me will share your secretary. It was an office of 3-4 people. And I worked for him 7 years. After 7 years, my department was bigger than the whole office. But that's only the grace of God. And that's what I'm trying to say. I didn't have a plan. God had a plan. I was not qualified. I'm still not qualified. But God, by His wisdom and by His grace, had a plan.
You've been listening to Samuel Smadja, and we'll hear more of his story on next week's programme. The Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a Christian charity based in the UK that supports the needs of both Jewish believers and Arab or Palestinian Christians living in Israel and the wider Middle East. If you'd like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please visit our website, olivetreefund.org. Meanwhile, join me at the same time next week for another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.